The war was being lost, and America hadn't stepped in yet. By the early 1940s, the world no longer felt stable. Nations were collapsing faster than anyone had predicted, and every victory made the enemy stronger, more confident, and more aggressive. What many believed would take years was being decided in months, sometimes in weeks. The balance of power was shifting, and it was shifting fast. What frightened leaders was not just the speed of the collapse, but the realization that once momentum was lost, it was almost impossible to regain it. Across Europe, armies that were once considered untouchable were falling one after another. Borders that had existed for generations vanished almost overnight. Governments collapsed, alliances broke apart, and millions realized that this war was not slowing down. It was accelerating. Each defeat carried consequences far beyond the battlefield, destabilizing economies, destroying political systems, and leaving entire populations exposed. Every delay, every moment of hesitation only made the situation worse, reinforcing the idea that resistance was becoming futile. By 1940, much of Europe was already on the brink of total collapse. Only a few nations remained standing, isolated and exhausted, fighting a war they could no longer sustain alone. Britain stood under constant attack, its skies burning night after night, its cities scarred by bombings, its people living with the daily expectation of destruction. Resources were stretched to the limit, aircraft were lost faster than they could be replaced, and every battle felt like a test of endurance rather than a path to victory. Britain was holding the line, but it was doing so at an enormous cost. Across the oceans, another front was expanding just as rapidly. In the Pacific, territories fell with alarming speed. Strategic islands, naval bases, and key supply routes were seized, reshaping control over entire regions. Trade routes that supported global economies were threatened, and the war began to expose how deeply interconnected the world had become. This was no longer a conflict confined to Europe or Asia. It was becoming a global crisis, one that affected every major power, whether it was directly involved or not. And through all of this, the United States remained on the sidelines. Powerful, industrialized, and capable of producing more than any other nation, America watched as the world shifted around it. The country possessed vast factories, immense natural resources, and a population unmatched in industrial potential. Yet public opinion remained divided. The scars of the previous World War were still present, and many Americans believed that involvement would only repeat the same sacrifices without guaranteeing stability. But time was not neutral. While America debated, the war continued to reshape the world. Each passing month weakened those still resisting and strengthened those advancing. Allies lost territory, manpower, and hope. Opposing forces gained confidence, adapting their strategies and expanding their reach. The longer the United States remained outside the conflict, the clearer it became that the outcome was being decided without American influence. What had once seemed like a distant conflict, rooted in foreign politics and old rivalries, had transformed into something far more dangerous. Entire nations were being absorbed into the war, not because they chose to fight, but because the conflict no longer allowed neutrality to exist. Borders meant little when air power, naval dominance, and industrial scale could project force across continents. The belief that distance alone could provide safety was rapidly fading. Military experts around the world began to understand the deeper problem. This was not simply a war of armies, but a war of production, logistics, and endurance. Victory would belong not just to those who fought bravely, but to those who could sustain the fight longer than anyone else. Factories, shipyards, rail networks, and supply chains became as important as soldiers on the front lines. And in this type of war, the balance was dangerously uneven. For civilians, the consequences were devastating. Food shortages became common, cities were evacuated, and daily life was reshaped by fear and uncertainty. Families were separated, economies strained, and entire generations grew up under the shadow of conflict. Governments struggled to maintain order and morale while facing pressure from both external enemies and internal collapse. What made the situation even more dangerous was the growing belief that the war's momentum could no longer be stopped through resistance alone. Meanwhile, intelligence reports began painting a clearer picture behind closed doors. Analysts warned that the conflict would not resolve itself through exhaustion. Instead, it would continue expanding until a decisive force altered its direction. Military planners increasingly understood that without overwhelming industrial and logistical power entering the war, the balance would continue to tilt toward collapse. The question was no longer whether the war would affect the United States, but when and how. By late 1941, the signs were impossible to ignore. Strategic losses mounted, global trade was disrupted, and aggression intensified across multiple fronts. Diplomatic solutions failed one after another, and the idea of a negotiated peace became increasingly unrealistic. What had once been framed as a distant conflict was now threatening the global order that allowed nations to prosper. The cost of inaction was rising faster than the cost of involvement. This was the moment when history stood still, balanced on a single decision. The world was losing the war not because resistance had ended, but because resistance alone was no longer enough. The conflict demanded resources, coordination, and scale beyond what most nations could provide. It demanded a response that matched the size of the crisis itself. And whether the United States chose to act or remain distant would define not only the outcome of the war, but the structure of the world that would emerge afterward. Because once the United States made its choice, neutrality would no longer exist. The war would change in ways no one could reverse. Industrial power would reshape battlefields, logistics would redefine strategy, and the balance that once seemed lost would begin to shift. This was the final moment before everything changed. This was the world before America stepped in. When America leads, history changes.